For those of you who don't know me, I'm Orville Schell, and I direct the Center in U.S. China Relations here, and I want to welcome our colleagues from MERICS in Berlin, with whom we've worked on a number of projects. They've put out this very interesting report that you all have copies of, Authoritarian Advance Responding to China's Growing Political Influence in Europe. This comes at an exceedingly important time, I think, when many countries feel or are experiencing a sea change in how China interacts with them, not only economically, but also a greater aspiration to have more influence, as the Chinese put it, to tell the China story better. There are many versions of this in different countries around the world, but each of the versions, I think, is an important part of a puzzle that is slowly pixelating. And this is very interesting to us here at the Asia Society, because Susan Shirk and I have a task force on U.S. China policy that also has a major working group that we do with Sunnylands and the Hoover Institution at Stanford that is looking at this question from the U.S. point of view, and recently had a meeting at Sunnylands where we had people from New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Germany, France, UK, and Canada, and the U.S. So I read this with great interest. So what I thought we would do here is ask our colleagues, Kristin Shi-Kupfer and Mareike Ohlberg from Berlin, if they would sort of just give us the highlights of this report, why they did it, what they found, and what this represents in terms of a change in the way China, which traditionally, as you all know, is kind of hunkered down and just minded its own business without any great pretension, at least since the Maoist era, of expanding abroad. And then let Susan Shirk, my colleague and comrade in arms, comment, and Danny Russel, who is at the Asia Society Policy Institute and was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs. Before I turn it over to our Berlin colleagues, I want to, and I'm sorry to embarrass you, Liz, but The Third Revolution by Elizabeth Economy is about to come out. This is a really important read, because if you want to understand what our two colleagues from Berlin are talking about, this will tell you the context of what Xi Jinping really is up to, and why this great China dream, rejuvenation of China, includes this notion of China projecting itself in a more grand way abroad. So, sorry, Liz. Okay, so Kristin, do you want to start, or yes. Mareike? Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Orville, Schell, for having us here. It's a great honor and privilege to be able to share with you, but also really to learn from you, also from Susan Shirk and Danny and all of you, what this means for all of us, not only for Europe, but clearly also for the United States and the global community. So as a starting point for our discussion, I would like to very briefly actually refer to the question which I found is really posed excellently by the organizers. Can the China solution help the CCP win influence in Europe? And I just want to pick, based on the findings of our two reports, actually, which you have in front of you, name three factors which I believe would play into an answer to this question, which is obviously not a yes or no answer. So first of all, I think this is an aspect we also got and still get very much feedback, various feedback from colleagues and practitioners, is the aspect, how do we define or conceptualize the whole concept or the whole notion of influence? Because within our report, we deliberately didn't differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate influence. And a lot of people think or thought this is a problem. But we do consider all influencing activities running from the overt to the covert, targeting elite level, media, civil society, into account, because we do believe if we take the recent, again, emphasized statement by Xi Jinping seriously, that the CCP wants to rule over everything, that we potentially have to always ask whatever private or seemingly only commercial activities may be, that we always should cautiously but thoroughly ask for any linkage which might exist with the CCP. And I think we also should not forget the distinct nature of the Chinese political system, which at least currently to me looks more and more like a totalitarian one. So, I guess my first point is we should not reject or denounce or be suspicious about all activities, all kind of influencing operations Chinese actors pursue in Europe, but really cautiously and thoroughly question their linkage to the CCP. And so my second point, I would like to emphasize the answer to that question also depends on the extent we are willing to very cautiously, again, differentiate between the CCP, the Chinese nation state, and, of course, the Chinese people itself. And, often for the convenience of language or for a quest to generalize, I sense that we, or I can talk of myself only at the first step, really don't pay enough attention and kind of stick to a hierarchy of CCP first, in a sense, and also to that account often leave the definition, what is Chinese, and also anti-Chinese, because this is often a claim then that comes up from Chinese actors in response to criticism or to questions we do have from the perspective of liberal democracies, that we should not leave this definition to the CCP. So I do believe that specifically the role of the overseas Chinese is very crucial, and we also mentioned that explicitly in our report. On the one hand side, we should be, I think, more cautious about the pressure they increasingly may face and do face. The United Front Department has made it very clear that they target overseas Chinese, that they request loyalty to the CCP ideology. So we should be more aware of that, I think, cautiously also try, if we can, to protect them. But also, and I believe this happens a lot more in the United States than in Europe, to really think about a more strategic outreach kind of dialogue with overseas Chinese, because I do believe they're key figures in that sense. And at least our feeling was that in Europe we haven't paid enough attention to that yet. And my last point is looking at the measures, what we can actually do, that we probably have limitations in that sense, how we really can influence China. So we can really kind of turn this around and say, now we want to kind of create a counter-influence or counterbalance, but really look more specifically, of course, what we can do to get our act together, to really reflect more about our own weaknesses and failures, and see this clearly as a challenge, as a systemic competition. And also, for me, it boils down to the question, what price are we willing to pay for really stand up to our interests and values? And we name a lot of them in our report. And price, on the one hand side, does mean, of course, we have to talk about financing, more secure, for example, in the context of Europe, fundings to Central Europe, to Southern Europe, also to make sure that our own institutions, media, academia are better and fully funded. Also think about investment screening, which is now going on within the EU. Germany, France, and Italy have proposed an initiative. To what extent do we want to include what kind of industries? So price means finances, but on the other hand, for me, it also means a more deeper reflection. What are the values we still believe in, and to what extent are we willing to subscribe to that? And also, to what extent are we willing to take risks, to also not always take the easy way, to maybe take some risks, take some inconveniences. It's not always convenient to not get a visa to China, for example. It's not always convenient to ask another set of questions when negotiating with Chinese partners, or also, to remind our own companies. Of course, they will always care for the profit and they will look for cheapest offers, but also involve into a dialogue with them that in the mid or long term, of course, protecting their interests is not in contradiction with the values they also stand for and enjoy, talking about transparency, a pluralistic society. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it with that as a first take, and Mareike will add also further to that based on our findings. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you also from me for having us here. I guess I want to highlight 3 points that came up from our findings and that I think matter for our discussion here. And I think the first one is that even though we've seen a huge uptake, obviously, in how China tries to, present its own model, its own China solution, there are very different, a lot of different words under which this has been presented. The main motivation, even though we see all this international activity, is still to us, from what we found, still appears to be domestic. So a lot of what we see internationally actually comes from counterintuitively, not from greater confidence necessarily, but actually from concerns about regime security. And we're not the first to actually to find this, but I mean, the CCP has studied the example of the Soviet Union in great depth and has great concerns about, is it going to be able to stay in power? And at the very beginning, right after Xi Jinping came to power, he gave a speech in which he highlighted the failures of the Soviet Union, and 3 areas were very important. The first one was failure to control the military. The second was failure to get corruption under control, and the third one was failure to get control over ideology. And guess what? In all those 3 areas, we've seen a lot of development since he came to power, right? So, and then the Arab Spring of 2010, 2011 added a lot to that concern about regime security of the CCP. So when the CCP talks about, its fear of ideological infiltration, I think a lot of it's actually genuine. There's genuine concern about that. And from the texts we've studied, there is this whole China solution that's brought out is in large part really just meant to counter that. The idea is that in order for the CCP to stay in power, it needs a more permanent source of legitimacy than just, economic development, which can falter, or nationalism, which can be turned against the CCP. So the idea with the China solution here really is to come up with better founded theories that justify the current political and economic order of the PRC under CCP rule. Now then, of course, you ask, why do you need international approval for that? And there's various reasons for that. One of it's really just that the CCP can show, look, foreigners are actually also supportive of our system. That is one main reason that also bolsters the legitimacy. The other is that I guess what comes up again and again in texts is that the idea that, we can't rely on censorship for all of our existence. What we really need to do is shift global public opinion in the long term to make it more safe for us to stay in power. So a lot of what we see is actually it's like a long-term game to buttress the CCP's regime security at home. So I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. Now that doesn't mean that this is all harmless. This is just domestically motivated. Quite on the contrary, I guess it means that what's currently going on is here with us to stay, barring any major changes in the PRC itself, because it's such a fundamental motivation. Now, the second point I want to go into is, I guess, why Europe now? Because we've been following this for a while, political influencing of the CCP abroad. And I guess 5 or 10 years ago, Europe was more of a sideshow. There were much more important target audiences. The United States was considered a lot more important. China's neighboring countries were more important. Obviously, the CCP was very active in Africa. And we have seen quite an uptick recently. And part of that may just be people paying more attention. But I do also get the sense that the official China does view the Trump administration as a big chance to actually gain allies in Europe. In the past, when you read the CCP talking about the West, it's usually, they have the West, which usually means the United States. And Europe was kind of, the sidekick that kind of always tags along. And now I guess the CCP does view a chance to divide and conquer in that sense. And that happens both with transatlantic relations, but also within Europe itself. You see a lot of attempts to divide Europe into smaller units and to win each over separately. And the last point I want to highlight here is, and that kind of feeds into something that Kristin has already said, is a lot of how this is going to play out in the end depends on how much we're going to be able to actually fortify, protect, and our own institutions. So a lot of the measures that we have to take are really just about improving how things are run in democracies in Europe, but also in the United States. The main example I've been looking at media mostly, and currently, you see a great uptick in attempts to influence the media. You have what you've already had in the United States for a long time. You have advertisements placed both by official party sources, or also taken out by individuals where the links aren't exactly clear. You have the same China Watch insert that's prepared by the China Daily and is run by a lot of, mostly in Western European media, El País in Spain, Süddeutsche in Germany, the Telegraph in the UK. So you get an increasing number of that. But then I guess since the financial crisis, there's also been a lot of discussions in CCP circles about, I guess, just purchasing media. And the most prominent example, of course, happened in Hong Kong, where the South China Morning Post was bought up by Alibaba. There was a test case actually in Europe with a tiny TV station, Propeller TV, in 2009. And that wasn't very important on that scale. But currently, for instance, Chinese companies have a bid on a central European media conglomerate. So I do think that in the past, this isn't going to go away. There's been great continuity, and it's been a slow process, gradually increasing. So we're going to see more and more of that. So in the end, this is going to boil down to how do we come up with, how do we come up with ways to finance our own media, our own academic institutions, our own think tanks, so that they, I guess, are less likely to turn to Chinese sources of money. And that's going to be very important looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mareike. I think if you look at this, it's maybe helpful just to, in your head, to categorize things. There's obviously China's effort in the media. There's Chinese efforts in academic life to support programs, Confucius Institutes, underwrite chairs, endow schools. We see with more money this happens more and more often. There is the sort of philanthropic aspect where you see increased wealth from private enterprises going into civil society organizations. And then there is an experience that Australia and New Zealand have been having, where there is a direct reach out into the political process, often through overseas Chinese, through actors, the United Front, et cetera, et cetera. But it's helpful maybe just to try to keep your head formatted in all of the different categories where we do see this reach out. Now, Susan is going to talk about another one where...
Actually, I'm going to do something different.
You're going to do something different? Okay.
Ask some questions.
You're on, Susan.
Okay. So hi, everybody. I'm the chair of the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego, and I enjoy being a kind of informal part of Asia Society family ever since I was here on sabbatical in 2008, 2009, and working with Orville on the task force. So as Orville was about to say when I so rudely interrupted him, another project of our task force is to try to figure out what would be the best way to review and regulate China's outbound investment, particularly in high-tech sectors. And through my work on that project and putting it kind of in parallel with this other part about China's influence efforts, what we see is that the backlash against China right now is not, A, it's not limited to Trump. B, meaning that it is much broader in the United States, including Congress, including the policy community, including the business community, and even folks like us who academic China scholars. So the backlash is a lot more than just about the Trump administration in America. And then what's really interesting is that it is as strong in Europe as it is, I'm not sure as strong, but it's happening in Europe, in the United States too. And it's happening in Japan, and it's happening in Australia and New Zealand for sure. And so when I have the opportunity to speak to Chinese of any influence or anyone, I've been making this point because it seems to me that this is very clear evidence that the approach that Beijing is taking to the outside world is producing this backlash. So you can't chalk it up to just national security or something, for example, or the strange nature of American politics under the Trump administration, because this is happening even in Europe, where the national security considerations per se are somewhat less important than they are in the United States. So there's a kind of overreaching going on, especially on the part of the Xi Jinping regime, which is creating this backlash. So that's my main point. And then one other thing that I'd like to ask Kristin and Mareike about their view, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about, is from the European perspective, how do you see the differences between China and Russia? Because one of the mistakes the Trump administration is making, of a long list of them, is that they're lumping together China and Russia, you know, in terms of major great power competition and a lot of policy recommendations, including things related to nuclear weapons and military posture, are framed as if they're responses to China and Russia threats that are mixed together. But especially on the political influence side, I mean, certainly in America, we see this very differently. And I also have to say that and of course Europe is on the front line of the Russia influence operations. So I'm interested in how you see that. And, you know, I just want to flag another big difference between China and Russia that I see, that from our standpoint on the task force, as we try to think about the best way to respond to these challenges, is that Russia, first of all, is less intertwined with our economies than China is. And the size of its economy is much, much, much smaller. And its own economic interests are very, very different, as it's kind of a petro state. And, you know, it benefits from high energy prices, basically. Instability in the Gulf and other things that it benefits from high energy prices. On the other hand, and Putin his motivation seems to be very much to subvert Western democratic systems and to stick the thumb in his eye of the United States in particular at any point he can. And he seems to make himself domestically popular by doing that. Whereas China's motivations, it's the size of its economy, its economic connections to the United States and almost every other country are much denser. And Xi Jinping's motivations are not that of a spoiler. He appears much more interested in gaining approval and status and respect. And that, I always feel, is you can work with that. You can work with that. And that gives you some opportunity to shape his incentives in a potentially productive way. So I'm interested in how you see the differences between Russia and China's efforts from the European perspective.
Well, Danny, that maybe is a good segue to you. Whatever other thoughts you may have, maybe how, as a diplomat, do you think a democratic country should respond to this?
Well, thanks, Orville. I think Susan is asking a very central and a very important question, and I'd add on to it just a bit by posing the question, to what extent is the attractiveness of China from Europe's vantage point a defense mechanism to try to stem problematic Russian behavior? To what extent is Europe perhaps hedging a bit in its sort of cooperative stance towards China, since Susan mentioned some of the similarities and some of the differences, but I think boil down to its essence, while both Russia and China seek to weaken the unity of Europe and the transatlantic partnership, only Russia is actually seeking to destabilize Europe. So I'm struck, not just intellectually, but as a practitioner of foreign policy, really by the first and the last of the conclusions in your excellent report. First, the importance of the collective action by the European nations themselves, the importance of unity, and the last conclusion about the Chinese diaspora and in the West, and how we deal with them, and how we deal with united front tactics. So on the first point, as Kristin said, we really have to outcompete China in Europe and in the United States in terms of operating credibly on the basis of our values and our principles and our shared identity. And Orville poses the central dilemma, which is that it's very difficult to respond to the tactics of a totalitarian state that is exploiting the openness of a liberal Western society without emulating those totalitarian or authoritarian practices and abridging our own liberties, etc. So how do you respond in a commensurate but an asymmetrical way that's consistent with your own values? My instinct, nobody has the single right answer, but my instinct is that it's a combination of common sense prophylactic measures in, for example, as Susan mentioned, screening investments and so on, with strengthening our own institutions and playing to our strengths. In the case of Europe, there are two immense sets of challenges. One is Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, the 16+1 problem, the success that the Chinese have in peeling off the herd, the weak links in the chain, And in, replicating what, for me, who spent my career in Asia, is what I'd call sort of the Cambodia example, where you find a member of the group, in Cambodia's case, ASEAN, and you use it as a chalk under the wheels of that organization or the society. You have an agent within the grouping of nations that will advocate for you and will block you. In terms of unity and coordination between the United States and Europe, which is critically important, I think Europe faces a different challenge, which is, in addition to the point that you made, Mareike, about the shift in Chinese interest and operations in Europe from maybe the periphery to the center, there are a number of areas where, frankly, China and Europe are more natural partners. Look at climate change, for example, at least under the Trump administration. Moreover, if I was a policymaker in Europe, trying to synchronize or coordinate my strategy for managing the onslaught of China influence operations in my country with what the United States was doing, I would have a pretty tough time, because one day there's a Xi Jinping, Donald J. Trump bromance and wonderful, red carpets and school kids with flowers. The next day, it's a $100 billion slap in the face, refusal to receive your envoy, Liu He, et cetera. So it's pretty hard, I think, to cooperate or to coordinate in that way. But I think the fundamental precept here, and it's reflected in the report, is the sort of Shakespearean, the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars but in ourselves. The importance of our supporting and protecting and developing and operating from our institutions and our democratic principles. In terms of the last conclusion, or the last point about the Chinese diaspora, I have questions and reservations about sorting out the good Chinese diaspora from the bad ones, the proxies, the agents, et cetera. I think that's a dangerous road to go down. But I do think that we need to be very conscious of the risk that in responding to problematic Chinese behavior, we wind up vilifying China and alienating the expatriate Chinese community, not to mention the Chinese people themselves, and there's 1.3+ billion of them. So how we manage this backlash that Susan referred to and that you've described is important. My view is that there's, along the lines of the biblical injunction to hate the sin and not the sinner, that it has to be managed selectively as well as effectively. If there is a predominantly anti-China flavor to the countermeasures, then we are certain to play into Chinese domestic propaganda and make it that much easier for the CCP to represent this as a fundamental attack against the Chinese nation and the Chinese people as racism. If, however, we can engineer a values-based pushback that gets at the behavior that we object to, not the fact that Chinese are exhibiting it, then not only can we dodge that label of anti-China racism, but I think we could expect a not inconsiderable amount of sympathy among the Chinese people who actually do care about justice, who care about fairness, who care about equality and so on. So the crux of the issue here, I think, is whether we engage in, as Kristin said, a competition of ideas or competition of systems, which can bring out the best in both of us, or whether this devolves into a clash of civilizations, a strategic rivalry, which brings out the worst in both of us.
Thanks, Danny. You know, I will note that in your report, that the last recommendation here, Europe needs to make sure that efforts to curtail the CCP influence agenda do not degenerate into a campaign targeting Chinese citizens and culture. That said, you all know, I'm sure that there is a kind of a presumption that all Chinese are sons and daughters of the Yellow Emperor. There is a kind of a strange ethnic presumption about Chinese, that if you're Chinese, you're ours. And so this makes it very fraught. I mean, this very dilemma Danny is trying to parse through about how you navigate this. It's very treacherous, and we've had a lot of experiences in this country from the Exclusion Act on down of things, look at McCarthy, degenerating very quickly. So listen, early mornings are difficult because everybody's in a rush to get someplace. Maybe we should just sort of throw this open to general discussion, but do either of you have a quick reaction to anything you've heard before we let others query you?
Very, very briefly, I promise, only 2 comments. One to the question Susan posed to us, so the European perspective on the differences between China and Russia. And I think a lot what you said, actually, I would definitely subscribe. We also collaborated with scholars who work on Russian influence in Europe, and indeed China's, or I should be precise because I said that myself, the CCP, the Chinese government influencing operations are much more sophisticated, much more subtle, and not as destructive and restricted to manipulation as the Russian ones. So there's much more leverage and room also to differentiate, to target, to see compromise, to clarify our own standards and legal requirements we do have, for example, for investments or for academic cooperation than in regard to Russia. I think that's very, very important that indeed she is not just a spoiler, as you said, but in general, we do see a much more sophisticated, subtle, and also in some ways much more, constructive, if you would say so, approach. And the second comment, I would like to respond to what Danny has just said, because this gives me an opportunity also to mention the other report we brought with us. I think really the importance of acknowledge the diversity of the Chinese society itself. We did a survey, online survey. We did several. Among 1,500 Chinese urban citizens, online netizens, so to say, and we also did a couple of case studies focusing on social media discussion. And what came out quite clearly was that the society is much more diverse, obviously, than the CCP would like it to be. They're much more open to seemingly Western, in quotation marks, or universal, if you would like so, ideas. Western influence is received positively. The view of the United States and Europe is as positive as China itself. So I think this is really important to take into account and to acknowledge and seek out and also respond to the CCP itself, that China is so much more than the CCP. It's diverse and it's pluralistic, and we should really not forget this and really be reminded of that. Thank you.
I guess the only point that I would briefly make is a lot of what Danny said is from, we had a lot of debates about this, and there is no consensus necessarily on, how to react to this. Is it more on the screening side? Is it more on strengthening our own institutions and values side? I personally, and this is my personal opinion, not necessarily of all of the authors, but I do think we shouldn't try to out the CCP, because it's actually it's been doing, it's working at this for a long time. So I do think I personally fall on the side of, strengthening our own institutions, our own values, and trying to stick with that as much as possible. But again, everybody has a different opinion on that. I just feel like that's an important point I wanted to make.
There's undeniably a huge amount of money coming our way. And as a mendicant civil society organization who's always got his cup out to support our own work, I know we're poor, weak creatures when confronted with a promise of money from China. And so I would say the first admonition in all of this is if we want a healthy society and healthy institutions, we should fund them. But good luck with that. Questions, thoughts from you all? Liz.
Thanks so much. Really fascinating presentations, and I can't wait to read the reports. So a question and two brief comments.
Microphone.
Sorry, I didn't see them anywhere. So a question and just two very short comments. The question is, could you share with us, maybe the top 3 recommendations that your reports make? Because the sort of the nature of the challenge, I think you outlined quite well. But I'm really interested in. So what do you think? You guys should do in Europe. What can we take away here in the United States?
Not you guys, Liz. It's us guys.
Yeah, no. I'm saying that we can learn from them. No. You're right. And then the 2 short comments. One, I think Susan made an important point about the backlash. It seems to me there is an element where the more that China tries to influence, it becomes very heavy-handed, has a very heavy footprint in some respects. It does its own damage, right? And we should remain cognizant of the fact that China can often shoot itself in its foot just by how aggressive and assertive they can be. And then the second point is really, it strikes me that, and I think you're getting at this perhaps, the best defense can often be a very strong offense. And we shouldn't forget that, look at the top 5 economies in the world, right? 4 of them, right, are based on, free market, liberal democracies. There's only one that's not, and that's China. And it seems to me that, in particular, I think, yes, we are concerned about what happens in the United States and Europe, but I'm as concerned about what China is doing in Ethiopia and Laos and Cambodia throughout the developing world. And I think part of our mission also needs to be to continue to press forward in our foreign policy with our values, right, that we should be competing globally, right, that we shouldn't forget that we have a very positive message to sell. I think sometimes we get in a very reactive mode when it comes to China. So I just worry that, they're pressing forward and we feel defensive, but actually we have our best defense can be a very strong offense.
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry for not making that clear, obviously, in our presentations. So top 3 recommendations, and Orville and Danny actually did a fantastic job to kind of compensate the lack that we didn't come up with this in our presentations ourselves. So first of all would be to really, and of course this is very idealistic, but still important, to foster EU unity, and also from the point of view of the Western European countries, so the large, economically countries like Germany, France, acknowledge their leverage, their different leverage they have vis-a-vis China than compared to the smaller East European countries. Because for them, for example, the 16+1 is often the only chance to get really FaceTime with the Chinese president. This is why this forum, this channel is so important to them. And the larger European countries should probably more acknowledge that in some sense and try to leverage their own influence and their own kind of channels with China more in regard to the smaller European countries. So a collective effort, unity is clearly important. Investment screening mechanisms, this is an ongoing discussion. Also, to what extent we make this argument, we should also include, for example, the media and the academia, education as, so to say, strategic industries or sectors in a sense, not only energy or like telecommunications, for example. And a third important, I recommend.
Is your recommendation that we do include media and education as strategic industries?
Not particularly in the same sense like investment screening, but to acknowledge at some points that there could be also strategic targets for investment and maybe think about similar mechanisms, not at the very same level because obviously they're not on the same page. But yeah, look at them more also as strategic sectors the Chinese government is looking into. And the third, I think, a key recommendation also has come up already concerning financial funding, strengthening of struggling publishing houses, universities. And also in regard to codes of conduct, solidarity, an exchange of what kind of responses do work or don't work. So not only tracking Chinese influencing operations, but also be more open and transparent about how do we all find ways to deal with that and respond to that. So a more open sharing, I guess, of experiences.
Thanks. Oh, okay, great. Sorry, so this, I came late, I apologize. But a very quick question.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Matt Ryder. I was a China Fulbright scholar, China scholar for several years. I now work for IBM. I moved over to the tech side. My question is how much, in your opinion, so these key recommendations that you've just outlined, which I think are terrific, how many of these could have not necessarily been accomplished, but we could have made greater progress under the terms of TPP that we understood and expected through 2016 as kind of the path forward? So my question is that are we quickly regrouping and trying to understand what we need in the sense of a relationship between the two countries, or now many countries, I should say, given the loss of TPP, or is this something that was not necessarily related to TPP?
Maybe Susan or Danny have thoughts?
I don't think TPP would have helped with this dimension, because this is really on the it's not it's not trade related, it's not standards, it's not labor standards, or maybe media is one area and where there's a little bit of overlap, but I actually don't think there was anything in TPP that would have prevented Chinese efforts to influence the media in our countries. So I think it's orthogonal. It's just a different set of issues.
I'll give a different answer. I think that TPP would have made a difference in the sense that TPP was a political and a systemic measure that established the dominant structure for the Asia-Pacific region and established the principle that kind of the organizing force for the future was going to be this collective aim at a set of high principles and high standards, and that in the absence of a full TPP, you've got a rump TPP 11, not including the United States, but in the absence of a full TPP, China becomes the only game in town. And China went from the defensive to the offensive in one fell swoop. It also, of course, the withdrawal from TPP also raised real questions about American reliability, staying power, commitment, determination, et cetera. And while not directly, I think this all feeds into an environment that favors the kind of manipulation that we're seeing from China.
So thank you. That's where I was going with my question. So 5 years ago, I was at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy studying, and this was all the conversation, TPP and the transatlantic partnership. And the concept or the idea, at least among people that we were hearing from State Department or elsewhere, was this idea of kind of these greater collective bargaining, these greater coalitions of states that could create better terms for investment, that could create better terms for kind of these collaborative initiatives or just a strength and power, I think, in a sense, against a pushback against China, and that's where I was headed. And I don't know if
actually, in our task force, we didn't see it so much as a pushback against China as setting a high standard and creating stronger multilateral principles and norms. And we had the hope that China would eventually join TPP. And it would play a role similar to WTO in helping the reformers in China get leverage to push through the next stage of market reforms inside China. So, I mean, I know it was viewed as anti-China, but that I think that's an exaggeration. It's not exactly right. The idea was to try to nudge China back, on a reform path.
The way, I mean, I read sort of what you all at MERICS have done, and I think the evolution of our thinking is that more and more, however we do this, and TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump canceled, was a piece of this, is that it's incumbent upon open market societies, liberal democratic societies, if we actually believe in them, even though we sometimes get very discouraged with the functioning of our own societies, they do need to get together somehow. And there are many, many ways to do that. But it is a very, very difficult task, as the EU is living proof. They are together, and yet they are still a dish of loose sand. And so how to do that? And China is expert at picking people off one at a time. I was in Switzerland with the head of your institution recently, and I was really stunned to find that, the Chinese have, the One Belt, One Road, they've identified Switzerland as sort of the terminus of it. Why? Because it's not in the EU. And the Swiss hadn't a clue. We went to the Swiss State Department, and, Chinese had bought Novartis, they'd bought Swissport, they'd bought a whole bunch of Swiss companies, Hainan Airways, which is a very strangely organized company that's now in deep financial hot water. And poor little Switzerland, with their nice little clean, non-toxic products and good little people in clean shirts, and their cantonal governments, hadn't a notion that they were the endpoint destination for this massive one belt, one road kind of epic.
The Chinese have told pretty much everybody in Europe that they're the endpoint.
Yeah, but Switzerland is particularly unique because it's not in the EU.
Yeah, but Duisburg. Yeah. And there are probably half a dozen places that have been told, you are really special. You are the ultimate destination.
I mean, concerning the Belt and Road, and this is another aspect of this whole topic, is to what extent, at least, do we in Europe have a kind of comparative strategy or vision or plan to really, connect even closer, not only countries within Europe, but then also looking at Central Asia or even beyond, connecting countries, building infrastructure, develop our own standards. I mean, in Europe, we're sometimes faced with this very peculiar situation that really concerning, for example, hardware or software standards, we have to choose between U.S. and Chinese. And as Danny has rightly said, there are also sometimes people now arguing, China might be not necessarily the worst choice, right, in some regard. Not only talking about climate change, but when it comes to software, hardware, security. So to what sense is Europe really in the position to say the one is better than the other? Although I made this point initially, given the fact that I do believe, and there's a lot of evidence for that the United States is a liberal democracy. The institutions work. As a citizen, you do have certain rights that are protected. The media is in full place. So I do still believe there's a difference when also for Europeans looking at the choices they have to make between standards or products or regimes offered by China or the United States.
We have time maybe for one more or two more questions. You and then Joel. Yeah.
It's already on? Okay, great. Thanks for the presentations. I have like 3 questions. The first is like, because you mentioned a few times that China is trying to dividing or destabilizing Europe. I wonder how much this is really intentional or a byproduct of Chinese economic engagement, like with some of the, especially with Central and Eastern European countries. And because I think that one of the interests of China is also to preserve a united Europe for the market, to have access to a broader market. Then the second question is why Europe? And I think that if you see at the investment, there has been a dramatic increase in investment in Central and Eastern European countries. It's still very marginal, and Europe is the biggest, or US are the biggest investors there. But how the Belt and Road Initiative plays into that, this increase of investment. Because if you look also at the cross-regional channel that they want to create, so Belt and Road, the Balkans and Central Eastern Europe are key to that. And also you mentioned, the last question, that China needs a new theory, because probably now it doesn't really have one, to be more attractive globally. So what are the limits for the creation of a new theory? Because I don't think now it has one that is quite powerful. Maybe the notion of common destiny, how does that, yeah, thank you.
Shall we? Okay, and maybe I'll take your last. I'll start with your last question. So I guess what China wants is kind of not a new theory, but like a bunch of theories, so that China can basically offer its own solution, as opposed to like a Western concepts, etc. And to some extent, it has been doing that. It's, I think, one of the first test cases where China launched this was human rights in the 1990s. Where it first tried to, come up with its alternative theory of what human rights are. And of course, in that case, it doesn't just come up with it. Sometimes it builds on theories that are actually supported here. And I mean, in this case, China has really focused on the right to develop, so that China has its own discourse, can say, which draws on, a lot of Western academic findings. In that case, actually, it's not just that it's all necessarily invented in China, but it works for the CCP. So we can say, what's really more important than all those individual rights is the right to develop, the right for economic progress, right? And that's kind of what it's trying to replicate for all different kinds of areas, including, what a democracy should be, what the economic system should be, how media should be run, basically for all those different subsectors of all policy areas. It's trying to come up with better theoretical foundation for its own rule. Now, I do think you're absolutely right that it's running into some difficulties with that, which part of it's just like you can't just throw money at something and expect it to build. I mean, China has been trying to do that it's been trying to create its own CNN since I don't know when, since the 1990s as well. And it's done a lot of that by throwing money at it and then expecting things to happen. And that hasn't really worked out that well, though it might still in the future. So I think part of it's just that this attempt to create something top down that has grown, I guess, more organically and naturally elsewhere is not very likely to succeed. But still, I mean, I guess it depends on how successful China is. I guess my point is you can't just throw money at it and talk over problems. But if China actually does succeed in multiple areas and continues to, grow and to stick around for a while, maybe it could, this top-down effort could take hold and actually gain greater support, but that's a very slow process.
A very quick comment. I found it interesting that Xi Jinping, in his most recent speech at the Boao Forum, explicitly mentioned that he said personally, 我很高兴. I was very happy to see that he also said 我的, my concept of this 人类命运共同体, this you mentioned this shared destiny. They actually don't use destiny any longer. The shared vision for mankind was enshrined or was accepted within the UN framework. So I think he, as Mareike said, obviously the CCP leadership pays a lot of attention to these concepts, and it's partly also, I mean, with that concept and the notion of what development, how development priorities should define, is also getting some, yes, definitely has achieved some success from their point of view. A quick comment on the investment, and I'm sure Susan and also Liz and Danny can have much more expertise on that. You're right, in terms of volume, actually really the EU investment and also investment by Western European countries is often much larger than the Chinese one, but it's a matter of what are the strings attached requirements, again, concerning public procurement or transparency. But it's also concerning Belt and Road, there's also a lot of, it's still, I mean, they have incorporated ongoing projects, but also a lot of them is still promise projects. And it's interesting to know that in Poland, for example, we currently witness a kind of shift, a lot more doubts and skepticism about what Belt and Road initiatives might mean for the local economy, or to what extent that really has materialized already. So, I mean, I think we also do sense that even within the Eastern European countries, that they, of course, do pay attention what actually materializes, what comes out of it for the local economy. So there's also currently a bit of an ongoing shift concerning that. Thank you.
So maybe one final question, Joel?
I'm struck by the fact that most of our dialogue characterizes the world order in two bilateral relationships. Is there a triangular world here? What does all this mean for Russia-China relationships? What do they mean? What does that relationship mean for us? Is that an opportunity? Is that a threat? How do we characterize the world if it's triangular? Is it triangular?
Danny, let's throw that one to you.
No, I don't think it's triangular. Susan already touched on the sort of Russia-China dimension as I tried to. Look, I go back to the point that the problem doesn't lie elsewhere. The problem and the solution to the problem lies with us. And so how we address the behavior that we object to on the part of China, how we address the behavior that we object to on the part of Russia needs, number one, to be differentiated between the two. Number two, has to be integrated with what other liberal democracies in the West are doing. And third, has to be part of a broader strategy that is built around our own values, our own institutions, and our own defense of democracy. I'll stop there.
Well, listen, I think we'll have to release you all to the craven world outside here after this very interesting conversation. And I want to thank our two colleagues from MERICS for coming here and this very interesting report. And Danny and Susan, thank you also for joining the discussion.